I worked on hundreds, probably thousands of files during my 20 years with Paul Martin. Files as a catch-all term. Fits most of the time. But in some cases, it trivializes an issue that is fundamentally important to the country. Bringing equal opportunity to Canada's Indigenous people is one of those cases. It's not a file, it's a right. Paul focused much of his political career on it. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, shares this commitment to bettering the lives of Indigenous people through the power of digital connectivity. Working in partnership with Indigenous governments, TELUS services 178 Indigenous communities in BC, Alberta, and Quebec. 56 of those communities are connected to TELUS Pure Fibre, as well as an additional 87 reserves, treaty lands, and self-governed lands. The TELUS Pure Fibre 5G network of the future will increase wireless capacity and speeds as it lays the groundwork for advancements in emerging tech sectors, healthcare, agriculture, and more. In British Columbia, TELUS has invested more than $25 million to date. But the real impact is about more than numbers. High-speed internet makes a huge difference when it comes to quality of life, language revitalization, better, easier access to healthcare, economic development, and jobs. More jobs. 20 years with Paul taught me that none of this is easy work. There are barriers to overcome, and it takes the committed partnership of governments, federal, provincial, and Indigenous, working alongside private sector companies like TELUS to make anything real happen. But it's the right work, and it continues for TELUS. You can read more about it in their just-released Indigenous Connectivity Report at telus.com/Indigenous Connectivity. All right, Herle Burlyites, we have the first of our 2 holiday pods for you today. Yes, large quantities of rum and eggnog will not bog down the Herle Burly over the holiday season. What better way to kick off the holiday pod season than to sit down with former Chief Correspondent of CBC News, anchor of The National for over 30 years, and legitimate Canadian icon, Peter Mansbridge. What can I tell you about Peter that you don't already know? Well, for one, he's got his own podcast, competing with mine for your time and attention. The Bridge explores trends in politics and journalism. Actually, my marvelous-looking and uniformly brilliant listenership probably know that already. There's the story out there that Peter was discovered as a voice making flight announcements out of a local airport in Churchill, Manitoba. You probably know that too. Here's one you may not know. Peter Mansbridge is, as much as anybody in the world, the reason I'm sitting here doing a podcast today. Because in 2008, after the 2006 federal election, Peter Mansbridge picked me off of the junk heap of Canadian politics and put me on The National for 10 years analyzing Canadian politics. And it will be impossible for me to be grateful enough to him for doing that, because it could have been anybody, but he chose me, and I appreciate it very much. We're going to talk to Peter about a lot of things today. We're going to talk about some of his loves and motivations in life. We're going to talk about his career a little bit, and we're going to talk about what's going on in the world right now. So let's get right to it. Hi, Peter. How are you?
I'm great, David. I was thinking just now of that junk heap back in 2008, because there were a lot of choices there. But you were the guy.
I was the top guy on the scrap heap. The shiniest piece of garbage out there. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Hey, how you been doing through this whole thing? 9 months now, or whatever it is. How you been doing?
Yeah, I mean, listen. When it started, is when I started doing the podcast, The Bridge, on a daily basis, and thinking, maybe 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and here we are, 40 plus weeks. It's been taxing, listen, for all of us. I mean, we're lucky. We live in Stratford, Ontario, as our main home. So we're kind of away from the main aspect of this, but we're affected just like everybody else is. Our life is very different. We spend a lot of our time in our home. And we've had to adapt. And watching the remarkable work that's being done by, frontline healthcare workers and grocery store clerks and postal clerks and farmers and truck drivers and all that, it's quite it's a humbling experience looking from the sidelines at what these people are doing to try to make our life a little easier. But this is a moment in history. It's been a little odd for me being, in a sense, on the sidelines, being out of the daily news business. During something like this, I thought the biggest story of my life would have been, 9/11 or a couple of others that compete as well. But this is unlike anything, that our generation has ever been through. And so it's a little odd to be on the sidelines. And I guess in some ways that's why I really got going with the podcast and enjoy it so much.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the pod. You're having fun with it, obviously. You're doing it every day. I know how onerous that would be. Yeah. What do you like about podcasting compared to television?
Well, you're liberated, right? It's kind of free time. You do what you want. I mean, mine is, unlike the Herle Burly, which is a major media enterprise. The bridge is like I do it. It's all basically by myself. My son Will helps on occasion, but basically I do it. And I set my own timetable as to when I want it out. It's daily in the sense of Monday to Friday. Have a great relationship with listeners. The people write a lot. I'm sure you see the same thing. And I guess one of the things I found about podcasting, at least so far, is the listeners. It's kind of a different level than you get in traditional media. I mean, these people are really committed to informative discussions.
Yeah.
And the mail I get is like really good. Like it's inspiring. It's revealing. It touches kind of every emotion you can imagine. So that's very rewarding. But I guess just the sitting down, and each day I kind of decide what I want to talk about, and away I go. And you know what it's like. It's all like I don't write anything down. It's just all sort of ad lib and stream of consciousness, and I go anywhere from kind of 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how I feel. That's the other great thing. You're not trying to hit a clock, or at least I'm not on mine. So it's fun. I really enjoy it.
So presumably all the time that you were on television, the notion of doing 45 unscripted minutes just off the top of your head on a subject of the day would have been a little intimidating in the sense that it's a high wire act. If you say something wrong, if you do something wrong, everything can end really, really quickly. Why are you comfortable with it in a podcast format?
I guess because I determine what works and what doesn't. And I don't go overboard and worry about things if I mispronounce a word, or I have to kind of restart a sentence because it didn't sound right. I just sort of do it. It's a very honest kind of way of reflecting what's on your mind. While I don't walk in with a script, I do walk in with certain ideas. I scan a lot of other news feeds during the week, and when I see something of interest, I'll write it down as kind of a headline, as something I might want to touch on. And what I've found for some reason, and I remember always trying to encourage you to do the same when you were a guest on my program, is be anecdotal. If you can make a story more interesting by adding something that happened in your own career that in a way relates to that story.
Yeah.
It's much better for the audience. They can connect in many ways, including allowing you to tell a story because you have some kind of background in it. Yeah. So I do a lot of that, to the point at which I'm actually now working on a book after years of saying I didn't want to write a memoirs book because it sounded like a kind of end of life experience, a memoir. Oh my God.
I'm done now.
Yeah, exactly. But, I, like you and like so many of our friends, have lots of anecdotes that we end up telling on the golf course or in a poker game or in the bar or whatever. And we don't share it. And these are great stories. Right. And many of them are about people, unlike us, who really made a difference in this country. And it's a whole other side of them that people don't get to hear. Like your old boss, Paul Martin. I mean, I was lucky enough through your old golf tournament of playing a couple of rounds of golf with him. And that's an experience. Watching him hit that ball is something that like the average guy doesn't know about, but you love to tell the story.
Man, between the two of you, that would be hard work for a caddy.
Yeah. I remember it was one of those trips to somebody, and might even have been him, said to me, you hit a lot of balls out of bounds. Have you ever thought about using old balls? And I said, I've never had any.
Oh, Christ.
What a boom.
All right, let's get some work out of the way here, Peter. You have a book out. In addition to a daily podcast, you've taken the time to write a book, co-author a book called Extraordinary Canadians. What's it about? Tell us what it's about.
Well, it's about exactly that. It's about Canadians who I feel, and Mark Bulgich, who's my co-author, who worked with me for years at the CBC, we decided these people were extraordinary in some particular way. They're all different. There's 17 of them. They come from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, different genders, different cultures, different professions, the whole bit. What I'd found, and Mark had witnessed because he'd been on so many of these things with me over the years, I did probably, 20,000 interviews during my career. And many of them, most of them, were with known people, like celebrities of some sort. Could have been celebrities in politics or sports or entertainment or academics or religion, all well-known figures. And so those were great to do. And I'm glad I did them, and I learned from them. But in many ways, they were kind of predictable. Most of these people had done many, many interviews in their lifetime. And there's only so many things you can say without it starting to sound kind of the same.
Right. They get a cassette, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the people who do stick out to me in terms of those people that I've interviewed in my career are those who, it's a cliche, but, ordinary people who had been caught in some form of extraordinary circumstance. And when they were telling their stories to me, the odds were that they were telling it for the first time.
Right.
It was unvarnished, unfiltered, no spin, the whole bit. And I loved those moments. So the idea on this book was to find as many people as we could. And I mean, there are some people who will sound familiar to readers, but most of them in there, they've probably never heard of before. And it was because of that fact they wound up in the book.
So what's the criteria?
Well, that they had in some way met a huge challenge in their life. It could have been, meeting the challenge of a disease or a terrible accident or racism, any number of different things. Challenge of arriving in Canada, not even being able to speak English, but turning that into an asset and a career and success, and how they affected others as a result of the way they met challenges. And we got lucky. There are a lot of people like that in Canada, and there are a lot of great stories. And we zeroed in just on 17. Simon & Schuster, the publisher, came to us in the early summer of last year, of 2019. And at that time, obviously we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic. We had no sense of what impact a pandemic could have. Well, we now know the impact it's had. And one of the areas the Canadians were looking for was inspiration from other stories. And this book kind of landed in the middle of that. So we got lucky. It was, it's been on in bookstores for 5 weeks, been number 1, 3 of them, number 2, the other 2 weeks. So it hit, which is a total shock to us and to the publisher, let me tell you. And you have to go into a second printing very early. And all that's great, but it also says something about the times in which we live, tells us something about what Canadians are looking for. and it tells us something about ourselves and about our country, because that's what these 17 profiles really do. They tell you things about your country that maybe you hadn't been thinking about. And it's not all perfect. It's not all good. You know, the one thing we love about Canada is that it stands apart from so many other countries in the world, but it's not done yet. We're not finished yet in painting our picture of our country in the way we want it to be. And this book shows that as well.
So, Peter, I'll be honest. Normally, if it wasn't by you, a book like this comes out, and I would treat it like I would treat a rock star making a Christmas album. Like this is some sort of, low energy cash grab at Christmas. But you're different.
Nice
You're
guy.
different. This is coming. You're different because you're one of the strongest Canadian patriots I know. Like this stuff comes really genuinely to you. All the symbolic stuff about Canada, all the war memorial stuff, the North, this is genuinely moving to you. And it's something I've always been interested in about you because, I don't feel it quite the same way as much as I love the country. Where does your deep love for this country come from?
I think it's partly, I wasn't born here, right? I'm an immigrant too. I mean, I was born in England, so it's a different kind of immigrant. You kind of get automatic entry. It's like getting a pass to a Leafs game. You just sort of get no problem. But I was born in England. I was raised in Southeast Asia. Then we came to Canada. Lived in Ottawa first. I lived in all different parts of the country. I didn't do well at school. I never went to university. Didn't finish high school. Ended up living on the prairies, and then in northern Manitoba, and then in BC, Ontario, have a place in Quebec. So I've been around.
You skipped Regina.
Yeah, I wanted to see whether you'd bite on that. I did go to the land of the Herle Burly, actually, where it all started, beside a small grain elevator north of the capital. I spent a year in Saskatchewan. It was a great year. It was 1975, 76. Alan Blakeney was the premier. Roy Romano was the attorney general. And, I got my first big overseas assignment because Blakeney got invited to go to China in 76 to sell potash. I mean, the number of calls I had to explain to the desk in Toronto what potash was. All they cared about is that Mansbridge, we don't care what you do, but make sure you stand beside a grain elevator when you do your sign off at the end. Because then they'll know you're on the prairies. Toronto, that's what it all meant. Back when there were still grain elevators. Anyway, I did spend a year in Saskatchewan and was happy for it. But I guess the picture I'm painting of my own career is one that really allowed me to see this country in a way that most people don't get to see. Because of my work, because of my constant traveling and moving around. And determined this great love for the country, understanding its history, whether it was the military history, of the First World War or the Second World War, Afghanistan, you name it. I went to a lot of these places. I brought parts of them back. I mean, here in my little study in Stratford, I have soil from Vimy Ridge. I have rocks from the beach at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer in Normandy, Juno Beach. I have a piece of the Berlin Wall. I have different parts of Canada that were established overseas in those, two great battle sites. But it was constantly on a hunt and a search for, Canada's past, Canada's history. Same with my love of the Arctic and the North. Here in my little office, I have a little vial of water that it's from the bottom of the ocean at the North Pole. I didn't dive down there personally myself, but it was sent to me by the captain of one of the Canadian Coast Guard ships that had been to the poll a couple of years ago. But I've been, all over the North. I'm fascinated by the Franklin story, not only about the tragedy of it itself, but how the constant searches for 50 or 60 years after it went, the two ships went missing, of how in so many ways that opened up Canada and it opened up the West. And the stories it told about the people who did that, not just the kind of European explorers, but the indigenous explorers who helped them.
What is it that you, as much as you love the country, what is it that you find disappointing or angering about Canada?
Well, the one area that I'm personally disappointed in is that we have yet to, find a way of resolving the differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And there's blame on both sides, but there's mostly blame on our side, on the non-Indigenous side. It frustrates me because when I went into northern Manitoba and when I started my career, I was a child of white privilege from Ottawa at that time. I had no sense whatsoever of racism. I had no sense of what it meant to be Indigenous in Canada in the 1960s. But it quickly became evident. And by the time I was like 21, 22, I determined this has to change. This is terrible what's happening here, and people are dying, and kids are being abused, and terrible things were happening. And so I just started using my journalism to try and address that by challenging, authority on some levels. When a federal minister had passed through Churchill, and that actually happened fairly often, and provincial ministers too, I'd be asking questions about this wide gap between the two areas of our life. And what makes me so unhappy is here 50, 60 years later, for the most part, there have been like some improvements, but for the most part, it's the same questions that are being
Exactly.
Nothing's like really changed. The fact that we've got whatever it is, 100 or 150 communities on boil water advisories in 2020, it's unbelievable that this would still.
Can you imagine how substandard your life is if you don't have clean running water in the house?
Yeah, or hydro or whatever it may be, but water. I mean, it's the water and air. You don't have those, you don't live.
Yeah.
Right. And people and young people especially are having to boil water every day just to simply drink. It's unforgivable, and I know government after government makes a pledge as they come in, this is going to change with us. And I'm sure they believe that, but it doesn't change.
Right.
It hasn't changed. And, and that's why, there are people in this book, the very first chapter is, the focus is on Cindy Blackstock, who is a name that some Canadians have probably heard about before.
Amazing person. Amazing,
incredible.
And it's impossible not to feel morally inferior when you're talking to her.
Exactly. She's, for those who don't know, she's, an activist who comes from the interior of BC, but lives in Ottawa now because she's constantly, at the government of the day to try and erase the inequalities that exist, especially for Indigenous kids compared with non-Indigenous kids. And, that's the focus of her life. That's all she works at. But she's incredible in terms of her determination and her courage and her resilience. And hers is a great story. And just like you, she's somebody who you can't do anything but admire and try to figure out how can I help? What can I do to make a difference?
When she makes her arguments, you wonder, how do people say no to her? Like, on what basis do you disagree? Right? I mean, she's a lawyer, and
and the courts keep proving it.
I know.
He's right, but nothing changes.
No, I know. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. Peter, I got to take a quick break for a sponsor. We'll be right back. Well, it's Christmas. And look, it's strange. The strangest in my life, anyway. We are explicitly told by people of goodwill and positions of authority to avoid togetherness, at least with anyone outside the tight family bubble. And it's pretty tough right now. A lot of people are struggling financially, and millions of Canadians will be heading into new lockdowns in just a few days. None of us imagined last Christmas where this Christmas would find us. But here we are. If Christmas is about charity, and it is, let's keep in mind that there's never been a more important time for giving. We have neighbors who badly need help. And for those of us who can afford it, there's no better expression of Christmas spirit than opening our wallets. It's also a good time to thank the people whose jobs cannot be done from home and who keep reporting to work, filling the shelves and checking out our groceries and providing medical care and moving cargo and all the other things that have maintained our way of life for the past 9 months. Our sponsor, CN, wants to express deep gratitude to its employees, the thousands of people who have faithfully kept the trains moving since the first days of the pandemic, and to wish Canadians a happy, safe Christmas in the embrace of their families. This too shall pass. With some luck and good management and vaccines, it will all be a memory by next Christmas. May we all have peace and a large dose of normal in the new year. Okay, hey, pandemic. Speaking of Canada, what has surprised you about Canada's response to the pandemic, one way or another?
I think we were slow out of the gate. I think everyone was slow out of the gate, and I think the time will come where we're going to find out what those earliest moments were really like, and hopefully, whether it's a prime minister or a premier or a health minister or a chief medical health officer, they will be honest with us about what happened the first day somebody walked into their office and said, hey, this virus coming out of China, we got to take seriously because this could be the big one that we've been expecting. I want to know exactly what happened in that room. I want to be in the room where it happened, so to speak, and hear that story, because I think, and almost understandably, there could have been a sort of, I hear this all the time. You've been telling me this every time something's come along, whether it was SARS or Ebola or whatever. We have a plan. Let's just use our plan and move on, and then move to whatever the other crisis of the day was. I imagine there was probably some of that. On the other hand, we had a plan on vaccines, and one can argue about how quickly we're going to get this vaccine out that's rolled out. But you can't argue with the fact that we did the right thing by buying up as much as we could, dealing with companies that we had no idea whether their vaccine was going to be successful or not, but right, to position ourselves in case it was. I want to know who those people were, how they went about that, because I think that's a good story. They've had to back it up with the fact that if we have way too much, which if all these vaccines work, we will have way too much, how we're going to move that to places that can't afford it, to other countries. So, look, I did a bit of studying, talked to a few historians about the 2018-19 flu. Yep. That we call the Spanish flu, even though it had nothing to do with Spain. After it was over, I mean, you tend to forget we didn't have a health department then. It's hard to imagine, right? But we didn't even have a health department. It was one of the recommendations that we needed a health department, and so we moved quickly on that vein, and that was the genesis of the health departments that we have now, both federally and provincially. But we also came up with a whole set of guidelines for how to prevent this from happening again. They weren't followed up.
No.
You know, we moved
No.
into the 20s, the roaring 20s. People's focus went to other areas. And then there was the Second World War, and this and that. And we just kind of left things by the wayside.
Well,
So
the
we
Public Health Agency of Canada was created for exactly this purpose. And by the time this event came along, it had been gutted and it was in such disarray and so divorced from science. That place was almost useless when the pandemic hit, as near as I can tell.
Yeah. You're talking about this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, we'll revisit all that. I guess at the end of the day, the biggest, not surprise, but the biggest disappointment is how we let down our elderly universally, you know, whether it was provincial responsibilities, municipal, private, federal, we let them down. I mean, my God, the number of deaths in long-term care facilities, old folks' homes is just dreadful. And inexcusable. And that story is going to have to be written at some point as to how that failure was allowed to happen.
Let's leave government off the hook for a second, not that they belong to be off the hook. But what's happened to the values of this country? Like the people who run corporations are just Canadians. They're just people who wound up in that job. And what's happened to the values of this country that a private company that owned long-term care homes, with this thing happening, would not spend whatever it took on the home, regardless of what it did to their profit margin, in order to protect their workers and residents, as opposed to not increasing their spending at all and continuing to ship their regular dividends off to shareholders. This is a values question, isn't it?
It is a values question. And it is, and that's why when I was listing all the various responsibilities, I definitely included private in there, because so much of the burden and responsibility and the focus in the post-pandemic period is going to be on how private companies ran long-term care facilities, right, what they did and what, more importantly, what they didn't do. Yeah. Not only at the beginning, but throughout. It's still happening.
Over the summer, nobody did anything to make it any better for the second wave.
That's right. And then the second wave hits, the same kind of things are going on that were going on in the first wave.
Yeah.
You know, in spite of how all governments sort of said, oh, we can never let this happen again, and we're going to change it, and we're going to have this investigation and that investigation. Didn't happen. And it's, you know, it is unforgivable that this was allowed to happen. And when it's so painful when you hear these stories about how these people died alone in their beds in a long-term care facility, and how they were, you know, it's unconscionable. And those heartbreaking pictures of people at windows, you know, trying to wave or touch through the glass their relatives. You know, these are going to be moments that can't ever be forgotten when this ends, but sadly, they probably will be, because it's our tendency to try and move away from the difficult moments that happen to us, and that we're responsible for, and we'll all have to bear some burden in this about allowing what happened to happen.
That's why we have to fix it now while it's fresh in our minds. You're absolutely right. If we put this off for even a couple of years, it will be yesterday's news, and we'll be back to warehousing people like we were doing before. Oh.
Right. Well, as you say, that's exactly what we did after the first wave. We just sort of, oh, well, that happened and it's awful, but let's move on.
Yeah. Unreal.
And we are in the same mess again.
Now, speaking of Canadian nationalism, Peter, one thing that I've always been curious about you, and I've never had the guts to ask you personally, so I'm just going to ask you on air. The gig that you turned down in the U.S. in the late 80s, do you ever regret that?
No.
I mean, you had, you know, such an incredible career here, but the issues are so big there. I mean, you and Ellie, our friend Ellie Elboy, both had opportunities to go down there and didn't. And I always wonder about that on both of your parts, the careers you might have had in the United States.
It's funny because we tend to focus on those who did go, like, Peter Jennings and others, and many of whom are, good friends of mine, still good friends of mine, who did in fact go. John Blackstone, San Francisco, Mark Phillips in London. But, in my case, it was complicated. It wasn't just, professional. It was also personal. I had a very, very substantial offer from CBS to go to New York and host their morning show. Yet at the same time, as that happened, the CBC, largely because of Knowlton Nash, said, hey, you know what? This job is open. My job, right. Knowlton's job. And you got to remember, like, where I came from. I was that guy who was hurt in an airport terminal in Churchill, Manitoba. I didn't have a high school degree. The CBC took this enormous gamble on me. Right. And then I worked very hard my way up through the system, including in Saskatchewan, to get to a position where I was considered for the top job in the news business in Canada, the CBC. And I just thought, I worked my for at that point, 20 years as a reporter for this moment. And here it is. Right. And I'm going to say no to this so I can go to New York and, interview, celebrity cooks and whatever. And I don't want to belittle it too much because there was obviously, the opportunity to do more than just that. But so I said no. Now, it's not like the CBC was saying, here's your job, plus, to earn a living, you're going to have to sell pencils at the corner. That's not what happened. I mean, they paid me very well and continue to pay me very well through my career. Although it's worth noting that when I finally retired in 2017, my pay at that point at the CBC was about the same as what I turned down in 1988 from. So,
yeah.
But I'm not complaining.
Not complaining. You have a unique perspective on the next question I'm going to ask you, which is, how has news coverage of politics changed over time?
It's much more negative, and I watched that transition. It really started to happen during the 1980s. I guess, through the Mulroney years, your old party, having the Rat Pack in the House of Commons that really went after everything about Mulroney, and sometimes for good reason, but in a very aggressive fashion. And journalism kind of followed suit. Not always sort of gotcha kind of stories, but focusing on the negative. And that continued on through the Chrétien years and still exists to some degree, although there's a danger when you're kind of the old guy. You always say, oh, the golden years, we did things, this way. Some of that is, can be directed at me when I talk that way. But I find, when you're a pollster, you look at data, you see the trend lines on trust for professions. And the trend lines for trust on professions for politics and journalism are kind of similar in their pattern of a downward run. Yeah. Since the earliest days of my reporting in Churchill, Manitoba, covering the local town council, I found and have found a much greater admiration for politicians in general than a lot of reporters do. Now, I basically say that most politicians that I've met over time, no matter what party they're with, no matter what they've argued, are good, decent people who believe that what they stand for election on are the principles that guide them. And while you might not agree with them, they honestly believe they could make our life better by following a certain set of principles that they have.
Yeah.
Now, but it's a thankless bloody job. Most people who run for politics lose, right? I mean, they don't get the nomination after putting everything about themselves in front of the audience. But if they get the nomination, then they go into an election, and most of them lose because there are 4 or 5 candidates. And what does the winner get after this process of, saying everything about themselves and putting their whole life in front of the people? What do they get if they win? They, in many cases, they've got to leave their family, move to a different city. In many cases, they're going to earn less money than they earn when they made the decision to run for politics. And, they got people like me running down hallways, yelling questions at them that in some cases nobody can answer. And that's the winner.
Right.
So I don't know. I've grilled enough politicians over time, but I've also have a deep respect for many of them, perhaps more so than many people do. And I think that all adds up into the trust area, because I think, I'll let politicians worry about themselves, but the biggest issue that the media has right now is trust. And, if you don't have the trust of your audience, man, you're sunk. You're in big trouble.
Peter, I got to take a quick break for a sponsor. We'll be right back. Founded and headquartered in Canada, Tech Resources Limited has been helping to build communities and the economy for over 100 years. They're committed to responsibly providing the metals and minerals needed for the low-carbon future and for building a better quality of life for people around the world. Sustainability is at the core of everything Tech does. That includes working closely with local communities and Indigenous peoples to advance reconciliation, create growth and opportunity, and ensure the benefits of mining are shared. Tech is setting ambitious goals to help build on their track record of responsible development, including setting the goal to be carbon neutral across their operations by 2050. Learn how they plan to achieve this and other important initiatives at tech.com/sustainability. That's TECK.com/sustainability. So the CBC, and particularly the National, used to be definitive, must-see television, certainly for people involved in politics and for much of the country. Nothing can be what the National used to be anymore in this media universe. So how does it change the CBC's role or the National's role when it is one voice out there in the world of information as opposed to the thing that everybody's watching at night to learn about what they should care about and think about next day?
Well, there's 2 elements to your question there. And the first element is that things have changed, and they have dramatically. I mean, it's just like the media universe is so different now than it was 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. It's much bigger. There are many more choices. There's a much different way that one uses television now than we did even just a few years ago. So in the midst of that, the National has to stand apart from all, its counterparts in the media. And why does that have to stand apart? Because it's different. It is a public broadcaster. And, in spite of the fact that at times the leadership of the public broadcaster seems to be more concerned about commercial broadcasting than public broadcasting. And that's terrible. And while I have nothing personally against any of the people who are put in the high executive positions of the CBC, I totally fundamentally disagree with the way those decisions are made. That those decisions are made by the choice of the government in power, and in most cases, they're not looking for anybody with broadcasting experience. And so these people arrive, usually for a 5-year term. They spend the first couple of years trying to understand what the business is about. And in the 3rd, 4th fifth year trying to put their personal stamp on the legacy of the CBC. So it's all kind of like a disaster. You can
That's
see
sad. That is sad.
You warn governments each time they're going into this. You got a problem here, and if you're going to fix it, and it's getting harder and harder to fix the CBC for the future, you got to have more care in the decisions, because and once again, I'm not pointing out anybody in particular here, but there's too often I've witnessed over time that the people who sort of come into the CBC for their 4 or 5 years in office are basically doing it to fluff up their resume so they can go on to the next potential job.
Really?
Oh yeah. I that's the way I've seen it. That's the way I look at it. We've had great potential presidents in the past who would have been spectacular. You take a guy like Peter Herndorf, who got as high as the vice president.
Yeah, what an impressive man.
Could have been a president.
Yeah.
Didn't. Left the CBC, went to TV Ontario, turned it into a great success story. Then went to the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, salvaged it from the trash heap that you got off of, and turned it into a great place. Could have been the same with the CBC. Yvonne Fetzan, another great one, who let slip through the possibilities of achieving the top job at the CBC. Anyway, again, I think it's a fundamental problem within the system that we've created as a country and as a parliament in terms of how the leaders of the public broadcaster pick. Because if you can't show that you are truly a public broadcaster, then there really is no reason for the people of Canada to be spending $1 billion plus a year on supporting it. It's supposed to reflect our country to itself. And you can make the argument, especially in television, not so much in radio, but especially in CBC television, that doesn't happen enough with its schedule. As for the national, it has to prove that it's different in terms of its not only its mandate, but its delivery of the mandate, that it is focused on the truth, that is building trust in telling the story of our nation. All this crap about it being a state broadcaster and at the whim of whatever government's in power is simply that. It's crap.
Wasn't my experience.
No, I mean, I was in one of the top editorial positions at the CBC for years, and never once did I feel an attempt to influence our decision making by a government, whether it was Paul Martin or Jean Chrétien or Brian Mulrooney or Stephen Harper. Never did I witness that happening. Did I witness all politicians try to have their influence in different ways on how we did stories? Sure, that's part of the sort of game of journalism. You get that whether it's politicians or business leaders or whomever. But you know how to deal with that. The only time I ever was aware of something like this happening was in October of 1970, where the Prime Minister's office demanded the CBC to do a certain. It was kind of reading out the communique of the FLQ on the air, and the CBC cratered to that, and so did its news division. And that wasn't a proud moment, but that was 50 years ago. I've never seen it happen since.
So if the CBC does all those things well, do we care how many people watch it?
Listen, there's no point in doing good journalism if nobody sees it. You remember after Barbara Frum died, and there was this attempt to kind of remake the National and Journal, and there were a lot of crazy ideas that none of us fought against hard enough. Some of us actually agreed with, that went through, like moving the news from 10 o'clock to 9 o'clock, there were changing the name. You take it, the brand name,
Yeah.
national. It's like Coca-Cola, for crying out loud, and we change it. Primetime news or some crazy idea. And the thing went so quickly downhill. I mean, I used to get the numbers. I still see the numbers, and they're, and it just went like this, right? It was just straight into the ground. Kind of like that description you used in the 2000, and which campaign was that in the middle of
Death Spiral. 2004.
That's exactly
2004 Death Spiral.
That was what was happening to primetime news. And I didn't realize it till the day one of our top producers came into a meeting and said, listen, something's got to change, because I know that some of what we're doing right now is some of the best journalism I've been involved with. But nobody's watching. And you know how I know nobody's watching? My family doesn't watch. My best friend don't. And if they're not watching, who the hell is watching?
Right.
And they were right. I mean, sometimes it takes that kind of stark description of how bad things are to shake you into saying, okay, we gotta basically, we started a coup to get back to 10 o'clock and get our name back. And it took a while, but it happened. And then it was a very slow movement towards getting numbers back, because it's in our business, it's, you can lose an audience overnight. It takes a long time to get it back. And you got to work really, really hard at doing that.
Right. And when you're trying to build an audience back these days, people don't seem interested in good journalism. They seem interested in news they agree with.
Yes. Some people.
Not most people?
Look, you're never going to get, we've never had most people watching any one newscast. I mean, CTV has the top newscast in television right now in Canada, and they're somewhere around 1.1, 1.2 million viewers, which is a big number for news. But, there are 35 million people in Canada. So, and a lot of them watch junk television from the States, including junk cable news.
Right. That reinforces their opinions. People want to be reinforced. They don't want to be challenged now.
Some people do. There's a temptation to overstate these things. But you're right. There is a sort of tendency to go towards, the broadcaster that's giving you what you want to hear. But I take some. I know we're talking much smaller numbers, whether it's for the Herle Burly or for the Bridge. But those kind of people who write the kind of emails we see, they don't agree with me all the time.
Right.
But they want to be engaged in the conversation and the discussion, and at times the debate in a reasonable fashion. That's what you want. That's what you want with you want a dedicated audience, dedicated to the principle of trusting what you're saying, and willing to discuss it and inform themselves to the point where they can have a good discussion, a good debate on the issues. So listen, there's a pathway for the CBC. The pathway isn't worrying about, man, if we make another stupid quiz show, we can earn a few more dollars. The pathway should be, we're going to do good Canadian content, better than anybody else does it in Canada. And we're going to fund and staff our news and current affairs organizations in a way that will promote a much deeper and better discussion of the issues that confront the country, and move forward onto those principles. But that's not the principles we have right now. They just aren't, because they're letting it slip away. And I've said that, to some of the people in the positions of power right now, who I get along with, but who I tend to think, they're not really listening to me. They got other things to worry about. But I've made it very clear to them that, in my view, you don't have a lot of time to fix this because you're losing support in areas where you can't afford to lose it on the part of some politicians. And I'm not just talking about one party over another, but politicians who believe in the CBC, and you can find some of them in every party. But if you're starting to lose them, first as an audience and second as supporters, you're dead. And I fear that in some ways is what's started to happen. So you got to stop that, and you got to stop it by proving that that you're better than what they may think you are.
Peter, to wrap up, I got some quick questions I want to go through with you. Consider this to be a mini McLaughlin Group effort here. Who's a journalist who's inspired you in your life?
Probably Cronkite. We tend to think that Cronkite only dealt with the truth, and which is accurate, and that is what's so missing in our society now. But he was also prepared to say the tough things when he thought they were needed. The things he said during Vietnam, that wasn't normal journalism.
Right.
That was opinion, and he was right, and it had an influence because he didn't do it every night. He maybe only did it once or twice in his career, which spanned from hitting the beaches of Normandy up until the Reagan win in 81. So I guess Cronkite internationally, and I've got a number of them in Canada who I am in awe of what they can do as journalists and as reporters.
Who is the prime minister that most impressed you?
Wow. That is tough. It's almost unfair.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
The first prime minister I met was John Diefenbaker.
Yep.
While he was prime minister in 1958. Now, I was only 10. But I have a picture of standing with him because I had been picked as a typical Canadian, and I did a film for the National Film Board called Michael and Mary. Mary was my sister.
Yeah,
is the name they gave her. We did a thing for the NFB, visiting the Parliament buildings. So I met Diefenbaker then, but then I did Pearson and interviewed all of these people right up into, and including Justin Trudeau. I don't know. Perhaps because of my age at the time, the one that I thought, oh my God, this is a big deal, was Pierre Trudeau. If you sat down to interview Pierre Trudeau, you better know what you were talking about, or he was going to make you look like a fool very quickly, which he did with me on more than one occasion. I recovered a bit in my latter interviews with him. But it may well have been Trudeau. I had a lot of time for Mulroney. I still do. I interviewed him about a month or 6 weeks ago, just before the U.S. election. And he was terrific on that same thing that you and I talk about, which is being anecdotal. There are a few people who got more stories than Brian Mulroney about world affairs and Canadian affairs, and some of them are even true. but they're great, and they tell us stories that we didn't know about ourselves. There are parts to Mulroney's past, obviously, which aren't as colorful or interesting or as good. But I still have a lot of time for him.
It may be. I was young.
Quite possibly. This one will surprise you. Your old boss, Paul Martin.
Yeah.
His commitment on the Indigenous file is so admirable. And, I can remember sitting with him when he was prime minister just before we did a town hall. And it was kind of like just an informal chat. And I looked at him and I said, you're not going to be in this job forever. I didn't realize it was going to be as short as it was, but hey, you can't pick your staff. I said to him, I said, you're not going to be in this job forever, but when you leave, what will you consider it would have been a success if you accomplish one thing? And he said, then the Indigenous file. So it isn't just something he kind of came together with after he left office and spends a lot of time to this day on. He truly believes the inequities that exist and that something has to be done. And he's going to do all he can while he's on this planet to try and ensure we're on the right path to that.
Yeah, and to your point about how people learn through anecdotes or stories, his commitment to that doesn't come from book learning. His commitment to that comes from a summer he spent working in the North, where the kids he was working with while in university, the kids he was working with were all Indigenous other than himself. And he loved them. He hung around with them. They had a great time, as kids would in the summer, partying and on their way through the summer. But he was going on to a life and a career. And they had no aspirations. They had no even idea what could happen to them. And he just couldn't believe that there was this difference between their lives, hopes, the horizons versus his. And it just never left him.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So who's the prime minister who least impressed you?
Jeez, nice guy. Wow. Well, listen, there were things about Kim Campbell that impressed me, but her time as prime minister didn't.
Right.
And the whole way she handled that was, and the people around her who were trying to make it work for her didn't handle it well either. That was probably the biggest disappointment, because so much had been hoped for surrounding her leadership. Didn't work. Other short-term prime ministers, like I had a lot of time for John Turner. I was, we became good friends, especially after he got out of politics, and eventually I got out of journalism, and I was sad to see that loss this year. And Joe Clark as well, who proved to you can go through humiliation and defeat and still recover to the point of making a huge contribution to your country and to the world, as he did as foreign affairs minister.
Yeah, I mean, he fought his way through such a terrible public opinion, public reputation patch, and just seemingly through sheer stoicism has worked his way back to statesman credible status, right? Yeah. And he always had the smarts for that, obviously. Okay, who's a politician you loved to cover as a journalist? Who was a politician you loved to cover?
So it doesn't have to be a prime minister.
No.
I loved covering Alan Blakeney, because I thought he was like an incredibly smart person who cared and yet had a real human side. I mean, he was the best crib player I ever saw. I can remember playing crib with him going on a train through China in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
Ray Natishan, who was great fun all the time. Kind of golfed like Paul Martin and me. The difference he had was he had Mounties in the bushes finding his ball for him. Whenever we got to it, because he was Governor General, whenever we got there, the ball seemed to be sitting up with a clear shot through the so he was on Bill Davis. Bill Davis, who's the last of that great collection of first ministers that we saw in the late 70s and 80s, of the sort of fathers of that Confederation era. And I think that's part of my problem, is because I tend to look at that group, perhaps because of my age and perhaps because we knew them all so well, as a special elite group of first ministers in Canada. There was Trudeau, Davis, Levesque, Lougheed, Alan Blakeney. There were even Richard Hatfield.
Yep.
There was a group of them there who kind of stood up above many of those who've come since.
Right.
But it was a different time. We used to see them as a group a lot, right? In first ministers' conferences, around the table,
debating the future of the country, debating the nature of the country. Can you believe that?
Yeah, I know. You tell people that now, and they look at you like, "Oh no, come on, that would have been boring." It was far from boring.
No. I was riveted to those sessions.
Yeah, they were great. Great.
All right, my last one for you. What coverage of an issue or an event are you most proud of?
I can't believe that you have not asked anything about the Leafs. I mean, I know you have this whole thing about the Habs.
Yep.
And, good for you. I'm glad, I used to like the Habs too when Dickie Duff played for them. But that I'm most proud of.
The thing that Leaf fans don't accept is that even 67 was a fluke. Like, you guys haven't really deserved to win anything for 100 fucking years.
I don't care if we just win. I just want to win. How they do it, just do it. Please. While I'm still around, you got to do it one more time. What am I most proud of? The coverage I'm most proud of? Well, I'm pretty proud of the way we covered the 9/11 story, both on the day and the immediate days afterwards. Although I got to say, I've come around to believing that we, as the West, totally botched the reaction to that. Totally botched. And it's causing us today, 20 years later, still enormous problems. And those Canadian kids who died in Afghanistan, like for what?
Just think of the wellspring of sympathy and goodwill the U.S. pissed away after that.
That's right. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so that and what it taught us about those kind of events and how to cover them in the future, I think we've learned a great deal from. I think some of the work that's been done on the Indigenous file is something that we can be proud of as media organizations. Not enough. I don't know who that is.
Apparently, I've overstayed my welcome. Your next call is in. I love the way we have tried to tell the story of our country. Could we have done better? Absolutely. But as a public broadcaster, as the CBC, I think we have, in so many cases, applied what funds we have the right way in telling the story of Canada, and getting away from Toronto as often as possible. That was one of the things that I pushed hardest for when in my tenure as the chief correspondent. They can't do it now given the pandemic, but I used to try to do the show from on the road as often as I could, because even just in the visuals, it reflected what an incredible country we have. Peter, you are, to quote John Turner, a great Canadian. And you have given so much to this country, contributed so much to this country, been so much a part of its story and history. I'm thrilled to know you on that basis. And you've been a really, really great friend to me over the years. Thank you for coming on this show. It's very prestigious of me to be able to have you on. And I appreciate it. And I hope you're going to be able to see Will over the holidays. And say hi to Cynthia for me, please.
I absolutely will. And David, I thank you for this opportunity of being on this show. When I collect and write my new biog for wherever it's published in the future, I will now include and a guest on the Herle Burly.
Excellent.
Right there. You take it. Have a great holiday.
Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks for listening. It was great to have Peter on the show. We've been through a lot together, and it was great to talk to him about things we've never talked about before. I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody behind this podcast, the Air Quotes media team of Michael Spitali and Jill Engelman and David Rosenberg and Jody Calero provide the best support for this podcast you could imagine. Metal Donkers Good records the sound and makes the sound great every week, despite my lousy Wi-Fi from rural Quebec. Andy Huckle does the video editing, so if you watch this on the YouTube machine or if you see our Twitter videos, that's the work of Andy Huckle. And I want to wish all those people a happy holiday and a Merry Christmas, and in the case of David Rosenberg, a happy Chanukah. We'll be back on the 29th with Canadian polling giant Frank Graves. And until then, to my family in Regina, whom I'm not seeing this year, Merry Christmas. Take care of yourselves and stay safe. And I'll see you in 2021. And for all of you listeners, thank you for being with us over the course of this year. We'll see you next week with Frank Graves. Take care.